Apologies if I am in a bit of a temper with this review, because I actually did have a recording for this review, but due to technical mishaps, I lost the original recording. So I'm just gonna have to record this review all over again. But you know what? This movie is so good, I guess it's worth it. So, let me begin this review with a question. Do you believe in the fire that never dies? I know I do. Amadeus is one of those movies that is described as perfect by some, if not many.
Amadeus. Another movie that's just perfect. Perfect writing, perfect pacing, perfect acting, perfect directing. It's actually much like one of Mozart's operas, oddly enough. If you were to add anything or take away anything, it would cease being perfect.
Or at the very least, many would say it is close to perfect, because more accurately, no work of art can ever be fully perfect. There's always going to be a flaw. I mean, even Citizen Kane had a flaw in which the man said Rosebud, but hardly anyone ever heard the dying words necessary to kickstart the plot. But anyway, there's a reason why reviewers on YouTube review stuff. Because they are hoping to encourage people to make the best kind of art they can make. I'd say society needs logical thinking critics and reviewers, because it helps people pay attention to what kind of art people need in life. These critics are necessary to point out the severe flaws of any art that is bad, but also to celebrate the art that is done well. And sometimes we are rewarded with that one movie, or several, but this one movie in this case, that just represents everything done right. The kind of movie that points to divine virtue. Amadeus is absolutely brilliant as a historical fiction. Most people usually get bored by these kinds of historical fictions because in this particular time period, a lot of these kinds of historical dramas usually involve people in upper class suits just sitting around and talking and melodramatically doing stuff, and it seems to be rather boring for a lot of people. But this film is anything but boring. The pacing is excellent, the acting is excellent, the choicing? The choice of casting is excellent. The way Mozart's music is integrated into the film, not just as a subject matter, but actually placed as background music to fit the different emotions, whether it be a foreboding or a happy tone, is excellent. Everything about this film is just excellent. So, what is Amadeus all about? Well, it's about the life of Mozart, primarily told through the life and careers of Mozart himself and Salieri, as the story is told from Salieri's perspective. The story opens up with an elderly Salieri shouting out, "Mozart! Mozart, forgive your assassin!" Ooh, already that's a killer, okay. After a hilarious pudding scene, it turns out elder Salieri has been trying to commit suicide, and so he urgently gets put into a place of care, presumably some kind of asylum. And here, a young priest, at least young in this particular version of the story, comes along to get a confession out of elder Salieri as to why he claimed that he assassinated Mozart. So, an elderly Salieri who's gone mad with envy and his own conflicting relationship with God tells the story. Now, it's interesting how people accuse this film of being historically inaccurate, and in many ways those accusations are true. There's a lot of historical inaccuracies throughout this film. However, the fact that this film is told primarily from the perspective of an unreliable narrator, which is Salieri going mad, gives the historical inaccuracies some level of credibility in a weird sense. And also, this film can be educational, not only in the fact that it can encourage people to actually research Mozart for themselves, but also give a glance as to what could entail from this what-if scenario. After all, what is actually true to history is the fact that Salieri did make the claim that he was Mozart's assassin. So this kind of story can have all kinds of speculation involved with that implication.
Now granted, the film is not entirely historically accurate. Mozart worked very hard on his music, and there was no proof that Salieri actually wanted to murder him. But people forget this is historical fiction. It's not supposed to be true. But I guess you can understand how people can get so passionate about it, because it is a very passionate film.
So, this film is based on a play written by Peter Schaeffer, which is based on the claim that Salieri made that he assassinated Mozart. And from there, elderly Salieri narrates a story about his own perspective on his own career as well as the life and career of Mozart. The story tells the rise and fall of both composers respectively, as well as telling us a great story about life and death and talent and passion and beautiful divine virtues, as well as being a cautionary story about envy. It's a brilliantly well told story. In fact, this film is so well made that the only closest thing I can find to a complaint with this film is the differentiation between the theatrical cut and the director's cut.
In fact, they released a director's cut not too long ago, and wouldn't you know it, it simply wasn't as good.
I've heard people say online that the theatrical cut is the definitive way to watch the movie because the director's cut just adds some unnecessary padding to what was already a perfectly paced movie. Whilst others say that the director's cut actually gives more character building and world building for people to let moments sink in. So, in all honesty, the fact that people's only complaint with this film is primarily centered on which cut is better, that just goes to show the sheer quality of this masterpiece of a movie. In fact, this film is so good, I might as well just spend the rest of the review talking about some particular scenes that stood out to me. There's one scene where the elderly Salieri tells the priest about one time when he found Mozart's drafts. Albeit Mozart's drafts are exaggerated to have no mistakes whatsoever, whereas realistically, even Mozart would have had a few sketches here and there, which he would have discarded eventually. But still, this scene brilliantly describes how Mozart's music is so beautiful it moves Salieri at that time and even now. The way elderly Salieri describes this music has such a brilliantly beautiful description. Unfathomable longing. It's that word longing that he uses to describe the beauty that Mozart's music brings, because the fact that he even uses the word longing indicates that there's this big standard that all art is trying to aspire for, and the best art can only be achieved when it reaches that divine virtue of fulfilling that deep longing for meaning.
This was a music I'd never heard, filled with such longing, such unfulfillable longing. It seemed to me that I was hearing the voice of God. I was staring through the cage of those meticulous ink strokes at an absolute beauty.
It's a brilliantly well-told description on the movie's part, which reminds me of something that C.S. Lewis said. If I find in myself a hunger for food, food can quench that hunger. If I find in myself a hunger for sex, sex can fulfill that hunger. But if I find in myself a hunger for meaning that this life cannot satisfy, the only logical conclusion is that I was made for another world. This movie brings up this powerful argument that we were made for so much more than just this material life, which thematically ties into the fact of why Salieri is so jealous of Mozart's music. You see, even though Salieri did make great music for his time and was respected by the higher-ups, and even though Mozart was an immature brat who didn't really appeal to the politics of the time, Mozart was nevertheless talented enough in this movie to make the kind of music that reached the divine, which meant he was going to be the one remembered throughout history. So it's interesting that if people wanted to make their art survive, their first instinct would be to just make the kind of music that's relevant to their time and just point to themselves in regards to grandiose self-righteousness, which is what Salieri suffers from. But Mozart has a deep love for God, hence the name Amadeus, love for God. And it's fairly interesting to see the relationship between like grace versus self-righteousness. So theologically speaking, Salieri prays to God for divine musical talent that can point people closer to God, and he'll dedicate his life to that sort of thing. I mean, that sort of thing isn't bad in its own right, but the problem with Salieri is that he became prideful of his own works. And so, because he became prideful of his own works, he was punished for his pride in trying to appeal to the people of his time and focusing primarily on himself, rather than just making music out of genuine joy of God's goodness like Mozart did. And all this subject matter is definitely enhanced with the weighty performance of Salieri's actor and the infectious optimism of Tom Hulce as Mozart himself, especially with that hilarious laugh that he has. Even the extras and side characters in this film were perfectly cast and give stellar performances for what little time they have. Even the young priest, even though he doesn't say much about the film, he really gives it his all with his facial expression. This is one of those films where the acting is so good, you kind of forget that they're acting at all. I like how in the flashback scene I mentioned earlier, the young Salieri is so overwhelmed by the beauty of Mozart's music, he has an eargasm. There's another standout scene where Mozart and Salieri create the Requiem piece by Mozart. They have to collaborate together because Mozart is ill at the time. And due to the way Mozart's music is integrated into the backdrop of the film, as well as being both diegetic and non-diegetic music, in this moment it's non-diegetic. We, as the audience, enter into this abstract, immaterial mindset of Salieri and Mozart as they're collaborating together to make this excellent piece of music. It's a really well executed scene. And another scene that I think really stands out is the ending, in which the elder Salieri accepts the fact that he is so inferior next to Mozart's music that points to the divine. Salieri just embraces the fact that he speaks for all mediocrities. Just for today, I will speak up for this movie. I will be its champion. I'll be its patron saint. A 12 out of 12! Go watch it if you haven't already. ScotsThinker signing out.
Like sweet music in one's ear, it only seems to get better and better the more you experience it.